Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this special YouTube live event to really help us better understand the human rights implications of what's happening in Gaza. My name is Pam Palmater, and I'm a lawyer, professor, author, and Indigenous rights activist from Ugbaganjig, also known as Eel River Bar First Nation, and that's part of the larger Mi'kmaq Nation. I also work in human rights at the international level, where I met my friend and colleague, Alex Neve, who is also a human rights lawyer from whom I have learned so much. Alex served as the Secretary General for Amnesty International Canada for over 20 years. And in this role, he undertook over 40 research, advocacy, and campaign delegations to more than 20 countries around the world. For those who don't know, Amnesty International is an organization whose mission is to take action to end grave human rights abuses and seek justice for those whose rights have been violated. Now you can find Alex as a professor of international human rights law at the University of Ottawa and Dalhousie University, as well as a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He is literally just doing everything. But no matter where he is or what he's doing or what role he's in, he's always championing human rights and helping to educate people, which I think is so important. Thank you so much for joining me, Alex, to help answer some of the questions that people have emailed and messaged or asked in person about what's happening in Gaza.
Well, it's fabulous to be here with you, Pam, even though I think we would both say we wish that we didn't have to come together for such a topic and under such circumstances. And I would just add, I mean, it's so kind of and overstated of you to say that you've learned so much from me, but I would put it right back at you that, you know, every conversation I have with you is about learning, and I think that's why what you do is so vitally important. You just have such a bedrock commitment to helping all of us learn from each other, and recognizing that we do have so much to learn from each other. And could that be more germane and relevant and urgent than at the present time with respect to this crisis? So it's tremendous to have this opportunity.
I know it's one of those things where usually you and I are engaging in a classroom or somewhere, and it's more of a upbeat scenario, but this is really an urgent crisis. And before we get started, I want everyone to know that we are being joined by our trusted moderator, whose handle is Purdy Tang, and hopefully Purdy Tang will say hi in the comments. He'll be in the background, keeping an eye on the comments to make sure that we keep this a safe and respectful place for learning. It's okay to ask questions, okay to agree to disagree on issues, but we want to make sure that we keep everything respectful and safe. So thank you for always helping us out, Purdy Tang. I really appreciate it. Alex and I thought long and hard about this live event. We thought about all of the implications, all of the ways in which we are engaging in this. And I thought it would be very important for us to specifically say what this session is not. And I think that's very important because neither Alex nor I are Jewish or Muslim. Neither Alex nor I live in Palestine or Israel. We're not a part of that. But I wanted to make sure people were very clear about what we were doing and what we weren't doing. So first of all, here's what we're not. This is not a political debate where we need to bring in politicians from all parties to state all of their political positions. This is not the forum for that. This is also not going to be a review of hundreds and hundreds of years of historical events between Palestine and Israel. And it's not going to be a review of the current social, economic, and cultural issues in the region generally. We're also not going to recount all the lived experiences, the horrors and atrocities of people. We're not going to get into the graphic details because I don't think we need to do that to understand the issues that are at stake. And I think Alex and I believe that we all need to stand up to injustice. And we don't think it's appropriate to ask the people in the middle of a crisis to come onto YouTube and have to shoulder that burden and carry that burden or try to convince the world about what's happening in their territory. And at the same time, nothing about this event or what it is we're trying to do here in terms of education condones terrorist acts of violence. Definitely not. And we certainly don't condone senseless violence perpetrated on innocent people. And while this conversation is undoubtedly going to be very difficult, it's very difficult for me, and I'm sure everybody else who's been paying attention to what's going on. It's still critical that we deal with it, because think of the people on the ground. If it's upsetting for us, if it's disturbing for us, and even traumatic for many of us to know that this is happening, imagine the people on the ground. The other thing that we want to make clear is this discussion is not anti-Israel, and we're not condemning the Jewish faith or Jewish people or anyone in any way. We believe that we should never look away from grave human rights abuses, no matter who is perpetrating it or in what country. It's just something that shouldn't be condoned anywhere. And finally, this event is not sponsored by any government, church, organization, business, or any other interest group. It's not sponsored at all. Alex and I are doing this specifically for educational purposes. And because of that, you shouldn't rely on this as legal advice, because it's not. So, with that said, Alex, we have a ton of questions from viewers, and I think it's probably best that we get started. And I think before we even get into the details of the law and human rights, and given the fact that we can't cover the whole history, I mean, we don't even have enough time in an hour to do that, let alone in a few minutes. I'm wondering if you could share just a very high level overview of what the issue is between Palestine and Israel. My understanding is that it's about land and independence and sovereignty. Am I right or am I off base here?
Um, it's obviously a great question to begin with, and I'm glad you've highlighted that it can at best only be high level, and in fact even a high level overview takes a certain amount of time because there is so much history here. It gives me a chance to I guess begin though by emphasizing, and I think this has come through in your comments as well. I just want to acknowledge that this isn't my history, and that I am so conscious of the fact that there are both Palestinian and Israeli experts who know this history inside out, and so I really offer a few comments with that considerable sense of humility, I guess. It's, of course, thousands of years of history. We're not always used to that in a Canadian context, perhaps, but it is thousands and thousands of years of history, and it's religious history, it's political history, and it's certainly a history of ethnicity and nationality. It's a history of conflict, of incredible chapters of persecution and violence. It's certainly a history of considerable displacement. And as I said, that takes place over millennia, and I couldn't begin to capture that immense sweep of history. And while history does matter, it matters immensely. It is so consequential. At the same time, I think, especially when, as we're going to be doing, we're really digging into what is the relevance of international law to what's happening on the ground today. Some of that history matters, some of it isn't directly relevant to those particular questions as to what's happening on the ground and does it constitute abuses. Certainly, I would absolutely agree with you. Land and sovereignty is absolutely key. It's absolutely central. And notably, I think that's something that many people realize resonates with centuries of struggle around Indigenous rights in Canada as well. It's certainly also very much about identity. It's about security. It's about respect. Some of the key moments along the way, and many of which people have likely heard of. I think often people begin by referencing what's known as the Balfour Declaration. That goes back to 1917. And that very notably is when the UK government promised the establishment in Palestine of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people. So there's something kind of an opening moment there in 1917. After World War I, Palestine, which had up until that point been ruled by the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, of course, had been defeated in World War I, and Palestine became a League of Nations mandate. That was the precursor to the United Nations, and it was governed by the British. Then, of course, and this is absolutely central to understanding history here, we have World War II and the horrific devastation of the Holocaust against the Jewish people in Europe. Over 6 million Jews dead, brutally, systematically slaughtered by the Nazi government, and massive levels of displacement. And that's another very essential underpinning to what's happening today. 1947-48, Britain withdrew from Palestine. Israel declared independence. And then we had, there's been many chapters of war. We had what's often referred to as the Arab-Israeli War. And at that time, 700,000 Palestinians were essentially expelled and displaced from their homes, from their lands. The Palestinian people referred to this as the Nakba. I think many people have heard of that. And in the aftermath of this, something else that people have heard a lot about in the last few months is when the UN set up, and I think people have heard this acronym a lot, UNRWA, which stands for the UN Relief and Works Agency, the specialized UN agency focused on aid and relief for Palestinian refugees who were displaced at the time. So that goes back to 1948. 1967, we have what's called the Six-Day War, and that's a very consequential piece as well, because that's when Israel begins its occupation of Palestinian territories, and in particular of Gaza and the West Bank. So again, just take note of that date, 1967. The occupation has been constant since then. Many chapters of peace, attempts at peace, a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, a peace treaty with Jordan, and of course something that also we're hearing a lot about these days. In 1993, we had the Oslo Accords, and that's the moment at which this aim, this proposal to move towards what's now referenced all the time, including by the Canadian government, as the two-state solution emerged. That's 1993. Do the math. Here we are more than 30 years later, and we're still not there. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, but that didn't mean that suddenly Gaza was independent or that we had the two states, far from it. Hamas soon after came to power in Gaza as the governing authority. And then immediately in 2007, Israel, as well as Egypt, imposed a total blockade on Gaza, which has been in effect since that time. And that's something I think we'll come back to later. Meanwhile, over in the West Bank, settlements were being established by Israeli civilians who were moving into occupied Palestinian territory and setting up settlements with significant support and backing from Israeli security. And we've now reached the point now where there's, as I understand it, thought to be about 300 of these settlements with around 700,000 people. We'll come back to that as well, because that's illegal under international law, and it in fact constitutes war crimes. Meanwhile, there's been a number of wars with respect to Gaza, 2008, 2012, 2014, often involving similar patterns of Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups firing a number of artillery rockets out of Gaza into Israel, and then Israel retaliating with a massive military assault with substantial numbers of civilians killed in Gaza. And then I think the last piece of the story, and it seems crazy to have just done this in whatever it's been, 6 or 7 minutes, is the current Israeli government, because we have to understand that in order to understand what's happening. And towards the end of 2022, there was another Israeli election. There are many governments in Israel because there are so many political parties, and it's often unstable minority governments that don't last long. But at the end of 2022, again, a minority government comes together, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been the prime minister for much of the last 15 to 20 years in Israel. And what he cobbles together as a coalition government is, many people use the word fascist. Whatever that means for people, there is no doubt that it is by far the most extreme right-wing government Israel has ever seen, with some of the members of the government, in particular the National Security Minister, Ben Gvir, the Finance Minister, Smotrich, extremist right-wing Israeli politicians. And that's just really essential to understanding the backdrop and dynamics. As to what then brings us to the catalyzing event, which of course was the horrific armed attack mounted by Hamas and other armed elements in southern Israel on October the 7th, with massive numbers of casualties and injuries, a huge number of hostages, many of whom are still held, or whose whereabouts are unknown. And then the massive military assault that has continued for the last 9 months by the Israeli military.
I can't really wrap my mind around when you say the last 9 months. It's such a massive issue, and to think it's not just a day or 2 or a few weeks, which would be bad enough, but the fact that it's 9 months, hard to wrap my head around. So one of the things, because we're going to be talking about so many different issues, and you've already raised, so many different terms, and not everybody knows what they are. Sometimes I get mixed up, and I know there's crossover between some of the terms. I want to make sure that everyone understands, like right from the get-go, what we're talking about, because there's key international concepts and concerns that are in play right now with respect to the Israel-Gaza crisis. And I'm wondering if you can kind of take us through some of those terms so that we're really clear about what it is we're talking about.
Absolutely, and I think people are seeing a lot of this in their social media feeds, or on news reports, or in conversations they're having with friends and neighbors. Certainly, one thing that has been in front of us for months now is the concern that what is happening on the ground in Gaza may constitute genocide. And I think we'll come back to this in a few different ways throughout our conversation, including when we look at what some of the international courts have been doing. But it's really important to remember it's a loaded, emotional term, which and of course has very raw significance for us here in Canada as well, with respect to Indigenous peoples. It's really important to understand it's not just an emotional term. It is a legal term. It is a recognized crime under international law. There is a UN convention that was drafted right after World War II, the United Nations Convention on the, and listen to the title, it's really important, on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. And I think that that word prevention in the title is so significant. And the Genocide Convention goes on, of course, to define what genocide is. And it's essentially a certain number of specified acts which are carried out with the intent to destroy. And this is something that becomes very consequential, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And the acts that are prescribed include killing members of that group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction. And people will want to go back to what I was talking about with respect to that sort of all-out blockade that has been imposed on Gaza. Measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So keep that in mind. This is the definition that applies when we think about whether what is happening on the ground in Gaza gives rise to these obligations to prevent and or to punish genocide. Another term that is heard of quite a bit, and I think also carries a lot of raw emotional resonance, is apartheid. I think a lot of people think that the word apartheid is perhaps specifically and only linked to, of course, the decades of horrific human rights violations committed by the white population, the white government in South Africa. But it is broader than that. This is not South Africa specific. It's recognized as an international crime. There again is a UN convention on apartheid. Apartheid is recognized as one of the crimes that can be investigated and prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, which we're going to come to in a moment. And there's a lot of detail to the definition, but essentially apartheid is, and it goes on to specify what kinds of inhuman acts, but inhuman acts that are carried out for the specific purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. And that can be by denying them the rights to life and liberty, by imposing horrific living conditions, by putting in place measures, including legislation, but not just legislation, that divides a population along racial lines, and many other concerns. So that's something that comes up quite often in respect to Israel and Palestine, and there are a number of authoritative reports. Certainly from the organization I was previously involved in, Amnesty International has a major report on this. Human Rights Watch does. Israeli and Palestinian human rights groups do. A UN expert known as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Occupied Palestinian Territory all have, and we're not talking 3 or 4 page reports. These are lengthy, evidence-packed reports concluding that what is happening against the Palestinian population, certainly in the occupied territories, but some of the reports go on to say even within Israel itself, constitutes apartheid. Crimes against humanity is something we hear about a lot, and crimes against humanity are serious, widespread and systematic human rights violations that are committed as part of a large scale, a significant attack against civilians. And much like some of the other crimes, so the Rome Statute with respect to the International Criminal Court has a lot in there around crimes against humanity. And it goes on to say what kinds of widespread and systematic violations as part of a large-scale attack would constitute crimes against humanity. And it's things like murder and rape, enforced disappearances, torture, apartheid. Apartheid is listed there as a crime against humanity, deportation, and a number of other things. War crimes. We're hearing a lot about war crimes these days. This takes us into what's known as international humanitarian law, something which was significantly strengthened right after World War II. Everyone's, I think, heard of the Geneva Conventions. And those Geneva Conventions are all about trying to bring some rules to what is perhaps the most lawless of circumstances, and that is war. And war crimes have provisions about protecting prisoners of war. They have provisions around protecting people who have become injured, fighters who have become injured and no longer can participate. But most significantly, and this is why it's so consequential with respect to Gaza, it's about protecting civilians. And there are really important civilian protection measures in a number of these international humanitarian laws. Essentially, civilians are supposed to be protected from armed conflict. They can't be targeted. They themselves can't be, but also what are often referred to as civilian objects, schools, markets, cultural institutions, that those can't be directly targeted. You can't launch indiscriminate attacks, which are, because they are indiscriminate, because there's no care being taken either by nature of the type of weapon being used or the way it's being used, that it's inevitably, even if you're not targeting the civilians, it's going to have impact on civilians because you can't control it. You also can't launch disproportionate attacks. If you're targeting a military target, a legitimate military target, but it's inevitable that there's going to be collateral damage with respect to civilians in the area, there's a proportionality test here. You can't, even if it's a legitimate military target, but it's going to have a hugely disproportionate number of civilian casualties. That's not okay. And when a state breaches those provisions, and there's many others in the Geneva Conventions, but let's focus on those ones around civilian protection. Those are war crimes, and I think everyone, we've heard that terminology in so many contexts with respect to so many conflicts around the world, and I think we all realize how important and serious that is. Terrorism comes up as a term here quite often, obviously, particularly with respect to Hamas. Terrorism remains a term that, the international definition of which remains a bit elusive. There are some situation-specific UN treaties dealing with, hijacking of airplanes, for instance, or financing issues that do have a definition, but there's not yet an all-encompassing, applies to all situations agreed definition of terrorism. Many of us, therefore, in the human rights community shy away from using that and instead focus on the things I've just referenced: war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, which are clearly defined, are absolutely recognized to be crimes under international law, and they apply to the kinds of acts that terrorist groups carry out. That said, it is worth noting there are terrorism-related implications, certainly in Canadian law, because Hamas, to name one obvious example, has been designated as a terrorist entity in Canada, and therefore there are some legal implications of that. I know my list is getting long here, but just let me say quickly about two other things that I think are really important here as legal concepts. One is occupation. And I referenced that when I was doing that opening overview of the history in the region. And this, of course, dates back to the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel took over and occupied what we now think of as Gaza. It was always called Gaza, and certainly the West Bank, and some other areas at the time as well. But the West Bank and Gaza are the two that have remained fully occupied in the more than 50 years since then. It's been a long time. it remains a bit of an open question, although we'll come to this when we're talking about international courts, as to, can occupation just go on forever, or are there legal limits on it? So let's park that for a minute. But what international law is absolutely clear on is that the occupying power, which in this case is Israel, has very clear legal obligations as to how they are to govern in the territories that they occupy. And I won't go into all of that except for this one very well-known example, and that is that the occupying power cannot transfer in its own civilian population and set up settlements in that occupied territory. And I think everyone who's listening today, I'm sure, is very aware of the fact that that has been a hallmark of how Israel has managed and handled all of the occupied territories, and in particular the West Bank, and that's illegal. And given that that is an area of law that is governed by the Geneva Conventions, then when I say it's illegal, what that actually means is those settlements, and let's focus on the ones in the West Bank, because they're so numerous, 300 of them, I referenced this earlier, 700,000 settlers, are war crimes. And then the last term I wanted to reference was collective punishment, which I think is something people have been hearing a fair bit about as well. And this is also in the realm of the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war. It is absolutely prohibited to collectively punish a group, a people, because of actual or alleged crimes that particular individuals or even a particular group may have committed. And the most obvious and egregious instance of this is the blockade of Gaza. The Israeli government asserts that it has been necessary to do so to ensure that arms won't make it to armed groups, for instance, that are in Gaza and attacking Israel from Gaza, and that there's other security-related measures necessary as to why that's an advisable course of action. It absolutely constitutes collective punishment. The 2+ million people of Gaza have all suffered what is now 17 years of a punishing blockade, which has made life unbelievably, the hardships that have come with that blockade with respect to medical supplies and food and basic infrastructure, on and on goes the list. And it absolutely constitutes collective punishment, therefore, again, is unlawful. And because it's in that Geneva Convention realm, once again, what we're talking about is a war crime. I better stop there, Pam.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad, because these terms matter, and I think it's really important for people to understand this outside of, say, your religious beliefs or political beliefs or anything like that. We're talking about law. Have you committed a crime? No matter who the person is, no matter who the state is, no matter what government's in power, whether you like the government, don't like the government, it's about law and whether or not law is being breached. And I think you did a really good job, because there's honestly, every time I talk to you, I learn something new. And this concept of illegal settlements, of the occupying force. I think that's really important for people to understand. And again, not just for a week, not just for 2 weeks, not just for a month, and all of those things would be really bad. And there's another thing I really want to ask you, Alex, because you have a really good way of addressing some myths or misinformation or misunderstandings about political rhetoric, right? Because political rhetoric can be very confusing. What politicians say, what they don't say. And there's this debate that's happening, or at least that I've seen. I'm sure you've seen it too, like over the last year, 9 months to a year, that really is pitting the concerns of potential genocide in Gaza versus Israel's claim of its right to defend itself. And I'm wondering, can you just unpack that a little bit? Because that seems to be a real stumbling block for, people on social media in general, but also politicians and the messages that they're sending. I mean, is genocide and the right to defend yourself, is that an actual trade-off in international law?
So, a really important question, and it is so foundational to what's happening right now. And I think we could go on for hours on this, but just let me make two quick points that I think are absolutely essential. First is there is, at best, a very lively debate in international legal circles as to whether even this notion of self-defense applies in a context like this. At least self-defense in the way that I think it's asserted by Israel and allies of Israel. The Canadian government has frequently, consistently actually, reasserted Israel's right to defend itself, and it's that kind of that defend itself piece. Because essentially what that is the Israeli government saying they have the right to go to war, which is a very particular kind of self-defense. The UN Charter, I always have my copy of the UN Charter close at hand. Article 51 of the UN Charter does talk about states' right to self-defense if an armed attack occurs against them. But here's what's really important to note here is around the world, by far most experts are of the view that that arises when the attack is coming from another state. So if not that I'm trying to start a war here, but if Egypt had attacked Israel, if Jordan had, if Iran had attacked Israel, then this notion of there being a right of self-defense in the face of that armed attack, we're in that territory. But that's not what we've got here. We've got Hamas and other armed groups operating from within territory that Israel itself occupies. So this is from within the country, so to speak. And the International Court of Justice, and I know we're going to come to the International Court of Justice and its relevance to all of this. 20 years ago, in a case involving legal questions related to a wall that Israel was constructing to divide Palestinian areas from Israeli areas. The International Court of Justice ruled that self-defense under the UN Charter does not extend to an attack coming from territory which a country itself occupies. So this notion that Israel can go to war, a self-defensive war against Hamas, is not well substantiated. And in fact, the International Court of Justice dealing with Israel has already ruled that that's not the case. Now, does that somehow mean, am I absurdly suggesting that when attacks like what happened on October the 7th happened, that Israel can't do anything? Of course they could. But what we're into is the realm of, not going to war. We're in the realm of criminal law enforcement, national security measures, and absolutely the Israeli government, with respect to October the 7th, any government, when faced with attacks of that sort, not only could, but must respond, prevent, punish such acts of terrorism or violence, but it does not give them some sort of unfettered international law permission to launch an all-out war in the name of self-defense. So that's point one. But point two, I think, is even more important, even if, and because there are some legal experts, and I'm sure we could readily find one who we could get online right now, and I would have a lively debate with them around this legal question. But it doesn't matter when we're talking about genocide, because the bottom line is self-defense of war, national security measures, policing operation. There's never a trade-off when it comes to genocide. Nothing allows genocide, nothing excuses genocide, nothing justifies genocide. There is no trade-off. So even if you disagree with me around that reading of self-defense and international law, it in no way, shape, or form it can open the door to genocide.
Such an important distinction. On the one hand, whether or not, this issue of self-defense and how it's portrayed in, at the international level, what the rules are around it, that's like the debate part. But I think you're really raising the there is no debate on genocide. Like there's just no debate about it. There's no trade-off. There's no excuse. It kind of makes me think about what you were defining earlier, this collective punishment, like punishing a people for alleged crimes committed by a small group. I can't imagine if that was applied in any other context in other countries, especially as you were saying, in the territory that's occupied by Israel. So, whether or not someone wins that argument with you about the right to self-defense, this idea that there is no trade-off for genocide. There's never an excuse under any condition, because that's something different. Genocide, and I know we're going to get into that, but one of the things I think it's really important for us to talk about is the international courts, because there have been two international courts that have been mentioned a great deal in the media. We've heard about it specifically in relation to Israel and the Gaza crisis over the last 9 months. You have the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. And I know when I'm talking to students in my classes about international issues, they have used those terms interchangeably as if they're the same thing. And I think it really is easy to get these things mixed up. And so I'd really like to hear a little bit about the history or the powers of these two courts, and what are the different roles they play? How are they different, especially in relation to this current crisis?
So you are so right. Everyone is getting it mixed up, and I see it in media coverage, including journalists who should know better. Reference the International Criminal Court when they really meant the International Court of Justice, or vice versa. So it is very easy to get the two mixed up, but they are very different, even though their names are so similar. The International Court of Justice has been around for a long time. I'll hold up my UN Charter again, because the companion in the UN Charter is the statute of the International Court of Justice, and that gives you a sense that it was established immediately after World War II. And the International Court of Justice is about disputes between states. So it's not about you or I can't be hauled in front of the International Court of Justice. Our government can be, or our government can haul another government in front of the International Court of Justice. Traditionally, it's focused on a lot of things like border disputes between countries, fisheries disputes, to name something that comes up in Canadian contexts sometimes, the treatment of foreign diplomats, the kinds of things that arise in state-to-state relations. But it's been around for over 75 years now, so it's got a lot of history to it. The International Criminal Court, in comparison, is the new kid on the block, and it is not at all about hauling a government in front of an international court. This is the exact opposite. Here, you or I could be hauled in front of the International Criminal Court because it is about individual accountability. And it represented the culmination of decades of advocacy within the human rights community, especially at grassroots level, to try to finally pierce the ridiculous impunity that shielded our world's worst criminals, people responsible for genocide, for crimes against humanity, for war crimes, some of the things that I was just referencing, apartheid, got away with it because there wasn't anywhere at the international level where they could actually be charged and tried. And the notion that they would actually face accountability at home in their national courts was, to say the least, almost always an absurd illusion, because politics and all sorts of other things were going to stand in the way of there being any kind of provisions domestically. This finally started to move in the 1990s with respect to Rwanda and Yugoslavia in particular, which really kind of horrified and shocked sort of the global conscience. Two special UN courts were set up to deal with those particular instances. But at the same time, that put wind in the sails of getting an overarching court established that wouldn't just be dealing with this conflict or that conflict, but would have wider jurisdiction. And it's worth noting in the late 1990s, and I think this will come back maybe in later comments I make when we turn to Canada, it's worth noting that Canada was at the time in the late 1990s, this is when Lloyd Axworthy was our foreign affairs minister, was widely seen as the global lead on this. We were the champions. We invested an immense amount of political and diplomatic capital, hard work at the political level, immensely hard work by our diplomats. And in 1998, at a conference in Rome, agreement was reached, and a new treaty known as the Rome Statute, because it happened in Rome, was drafted, setting up the International Criminal Court, which now has jurisdiction, and when and over who it has jurisdiction, we'll come to in a minute, over the world's worst crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and then a fourth crime, which I don't think we'll get to in this particular conversation, but what's known as the crime of aggression. So very different. The International Court of Justice, of course, we've heard about, because a state can take another state in front of the ICJ, and that's exactly what South Africa has done with respect to Israel on allegations of genocide. Going back to the convention I referenced earlier, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, South Africa has brought a case against Israel alleging that Israel has breached its obligations under that treaty. That case is still ongoing. We'll come to that. The International Criminal Court is in the news because they have had an investigation underway with respect, and I know we'll come to this as well. It's actually linked to the fact that while Israel hasn't accepted the International Criminal Court, they haven't ratified the Rome Statute that I just referred to, the state of Palestine has, which, even though it's not yet fully recognized as a member of a full member of the UN, and not all countries, over 140 have, but Canada hasn't, have yet to recognize Palestine as a state. It nonetheless has sufficient international legal standing to be able to sign on to international human rights treaties like the International Criminal Court's statute. And so that has given the ICC the hook they need to be able to carry out investigations. And of course, people will remember a number of weeks ago, there was blockbuster news that they are now in front of the ICC's judges, the hearing hasn't been scheduled yet, seeking 5 arrest warrants, 3 of which are against senior Hamas leaders, 2 of which are against senior Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Wow. There's just so much to digest there, and I know some of it's very, very complex, but I'm wondering if you can talk about the 2 cases just a little bit more, some of the key things that came out of those?
So let's go to the International Court of Justice first, and it's actually worth knowing that there's 2 cases underway. I just referenced the one that has been brought by South Africa against Israel, but there's also another case, and we'll actually have a ruling sooner in this case than we will in the genocide case. And this is what's known as an advisory opinion case, something the UN General Assembly decided to do in late 2022. So this goes back a while. And I flagged this earlier in my comments around this whole question about occupation and the legal question as to, are there limits on occupation? Can occupation just go on forever? Can it go on for centuries? Are there any limits on when occupation must come to an end? And the UN General Assembly, Canada voted against it, in 2022, voted to ask the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, for an advisory legal opinion about the legal consequences of the occupation, including the question as to whether it is now unlawful, either because of the nature of the occupation or because it has gone on for 50 plus years. The legal arguments have been heard in that case, and I believe we are expecting the court to issue its ruling on that question next month. So watch for that. The Genocide Convention case was launched at the end of 2023, in late December, by South Africa. The International Court of Justice, I guess, like any court anywhere, you know the old saying, the wheels of justice turn slowly, and even with respect to something as immensely consequential as genocide, that's the case. So the actual process of holding the hearing and having all the evidence heard and all the legal arguments made, that's still to occur in that case, and I think we'd be surprised if that significantly got underway any earlier than kind of the middle of 2025. But at the same time, South Africa brought an application for what are known as provisional measures, precautionary measures. Sorry, I'm mixing it up with another forum. And precautionary measures are, to bring it into a Canadian legal context, this would be kind of, for the lawyers in the crowd, what we think of as an interim injunction. That a case is underway, and it's going to take quite a while for that case to be heard, but there's something really urgent that needs attention in the meantime, and there's a very real risk that if action isn't taken to stop something, even temporarily, or force something to happen, even temporarily, then by the time the ruling in the case happens, it'll all be for naught because it will have already happened. And that's what provisional measures are about at the ICJ. And that was what there was so much attention about, particularly in January, because South Africa brought an application seeking a number of provisional measures, including, they asked for the court to declare that there be that Israel cease all of its military actions in Gaza. The court didn't go that far, but at the end of January did lay out a number of measures that it insisted Israel take. And as part of that, and sort of the legal wording here is debated quite a bit, but essentially, I mean, they haven't ruled on the big question as to whether or not genocide is happening in Gaza. That's for next year. But in order for them to decide that it was appropriate to order some provisional measures, they did have to go so far as to say, we think it is plausible that the rights that are protected under the Genocide Convention are in play here. That's a lot of people, as a short version of that, are referencing the fact that the ICJ has found that that genocide is plausible in Gaza. We can parse over the wording, but it is very clear that the court was sufficiently concerned that the Genocide Convention is in play here, that they decided that they had to issue a number of provisional measures. South Africa, Israel has not complied with those provisional measures. South Africa has come back to the court on 2 further occasions, therefore, asking for the provisional measures to be strengthened and updated, and very significantly, the most recent was in May, and the court agreed with South Africa, and they issued a ruling calling on Israel not to launch an offensive within Rafah, which of course has been a very serious concern for the last few months. Again, Israel has disregarded that, so Understandably, people feel cynical. What does that tell us about international law? Well, it tells us that international law is what it is. International law requires state good faith cooperation. And when that
Mhm.
doesn't happen, it's incumbent upon other states to make it happen. And here we have the big problem in that the U.S. is not prepared to go the distance. For instance, the U.S. would veto any Security Council resolution insisting that Israel comply with that ICJ ruling. Doesn't mean that it's meaningless. I think there's a lot of ways in which the ICJ's rulings have already been showing up in national level courts. There's been various court proceedings around the world seeking bans on arms sales to Israel, for
Mhm.
instance, and other kinds of legal provisions. And they're referencing what the ICJ has ruled. So it kind of trickles down, I guess, is I think how we have to sometimes see the impact.
And I think about it, I think maybe sometimes even when I first started out looking at international law, that if something is happening somewhere, that's their, their issue, and that the UN has to deal with that state, and for better or for worse, or, their lack of enforcement mechanisms, that was really at that level. But then when you think about genocide and how it's about the prevention of genocide, that would seem to me to bring in all the states, all the member states of the United Nations, to say, okay, well, here's this decision. You need to abide by it. And if not, we have no choice but to take action, like things like, no arms sales, or whatever else is on the table. So my question then is, like, given that context, if there's other responsibilities by other states to do something, because I've seen on social media all of these other states saying, different things, like they're removing their ambassadors, or, Israel no longer has trade relationships. Like, there's a whole bunch of different things being said by different states. I think Canadians are going to want to know very precisely, digging through all of the political rhetoric, what's Canada's response to these two cases? Because Canada, holds itself out at the international level as, multiculturalism, defender of human rights. It calls out other states when there's human rights violations. It calls out genocide, and all of that rightly so, right? Like, rightly so. So where's Canada with all of this?
It's not a very commendable story, unfortunately, and there's something to say here about both of the ICJ cases. So let me start with the first one I referenced, which is this advisory opinion case about the legal status of the occupation, the one that we're expecting a ruling in next July. Last summer, Canada did file a legal brief as kind of, I guess we might say, an intervener in that case, which is a possibility. Other states can make submissions even when they're not part of the main case, and many countries have done so with respect to that advisory opinion case. And essentially, Canada's submission was urging the court to reject jurisdiction in the case. So they didn't get into any of the arguments about, what are the human rights implications of the occupation? Is it lawful? Should it end? Should it continue? None of that. They just simply said, you should decline to rule in this case. And they said so for two reasons. The first was because Israel itself had not consented to the case going forward at the ICJ. And the second was they did not think that the UN General Assembly was the responsible body that should have referred the case to the ICJ. They felt that if any UN body was going to make that referral, it should have been the Security Council. So that was what Canada thought was worth saying about a really important human rights case on the world stage. When the hearings were scheduled earlier this year, so that was a written submission that went in last year, a large number of countries signed up wanting to have an opportunity to make a brief oral submission as part of the hearings. Canada was on that list. And then inexplicably, and as far as I know, it still remains inexplicable, almost at the last minute, Canada took itself off the list. So, so all that stands is that written submission we made last summer, and which of course was made before the Gaza crisis. To not have anything new or more relevant or updated to say to the ICJ, given everything that had happened since that written submission was made, I think, to put it mildly, was a profoundly missed opportunity. With respect to South Africa's case, I think a lot of people will recall that, especially when the first ruling came out on the provisional measures at the end of January, what we saw was an oblique, convoluted statement from the Canadian government, essentially saying that Canada is, as you were just saying, Pam, is a champion of international law. We believe in we love saying this all the time, the international rules-based order. We're a strong supporter of the role of the International Criminal Court. However, you knew the word that was going to come next was either however or but. That does not mean that we accept the premise of South Africa's case. So how you were supposed to put all of that together, especially at a stage where, regardless of what we did or did not think about the premise of South Africa's case, by the time the end of January had come along, the court had ruled. There's this court that Canada says it's a strong supporter of, at the court that in many respects is at the very pinnacle of the international rules-based order, had issued a judgment. Why were we not prepared to say that judgment should be enforced, that Israel should be expected to comply with that ruling? It took almost 4 weeks before we finally did come out and say that, not on our own. We joined up with Australia and New Zealand in issuing a public statement. Almost 4 weeks in the context of a situation on the ground, which the ICJ has ruled plausibly gives rise to concerns about potential genocide. And it took us 3 to 4 weeks before we were willing to say that Israel should comply. So it hasn't been our finest moment as a country that says we believe the ICJ is an incredibly important judicial body that has, an essential role to play in the rules-based order.
I never stop being shocked by the contradictions, and we know who's writing these, speaking points or whatever. There's always government officials writing these speaking points, but it either it is or it isn't. Yeah, there's support and respect and live up to the international rules-based order, or you don't. Politics, I know I'm not naive enough to think that politics doesn't play in here and what your allies are doing. But at the end of the day, if you subscribe to international rules-based order, then Canada wouldn't really have a choice but to encourage Israel to abide, especially since what you taught us at the very beginning of this live event, that the Convention on Genocide isn't just punishing people who do it after the fact. It's about preventing it.
Exactly.
And that's what really gets me. So very disappointing on Canada's part, and more than disappointing, because we're talking about genocide. This isn't like a international trade dispute and you just don't happen to agree or like that kind of thing. This is, people are dying. It's, whether it's called genocide later on or not, horrific things are happening and people are dying. So that's Canada. Now, Israel is the question here. Like, I want to put it to you directly. And obviously, we're not providing legal advice to anybody on here, but is it true that Israel because I think I heard you say that Israel hasn't signed on to the ICC's Rome Statute. And so it doesn't recognize the court's jurisdiction. How would the court even have a mandate to investigate if Israel says, no, I'm not signing on and we don't recognize your jurisdiction?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of an obvious question, isn't it? And so first, people have to understand that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction in a case in particular circumstances. So the first and most obvious is if a government has actually ratified the Rome Statute that I referred to and thus accepted the International Criminal Court, that means that the court has jurisdiction over any potential crimes that happened within the territory of that government, of that country, or crimes that are committed by nationals of that country, even if that is happening in some other country. So there was interesting investigations that were being carried out with respect to Afghanistan at a certain point. The US hasn't ratified the International Criminal Court, but Afghanistan has. And so even though the US hadn't accepted it, because Afghanistan had, the court was able to do some investigating as to what US officials had been doing in Afghanistan. Similarly, Iraq hadn't ratified the court, but the United Kingdom had. And so at a certain point, the court was also carrying out investigations related to allegations of crimes committed by US soldiers in Iraq. So it plays out in a variety of different ways. The other way that the court can get can get a mandate to carry out an investigation is if the UN Security Council refers a case to it. And they've done that a couple of times. They did it with respect to the situation in Darfur, Sudan, almost 20 years ago. They also did it with respect to Libya at a particular point. But that's obviously not going to happen here because the US would veto any UN Security Council referral because it always backs up Israel at the Security Council. However, people may recall, it may seem like an hour ago, but I think it was 15 minutes ago, I referenced the fact that the state of Palestine has ratified the Rome Statute, which it is able to do as a matter of international law. And on that basis, the court has jurisdiction. And that means that it has jurisdiction with respect to any crimes that have happened within the state of Palestine, which is essentially considered to be Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, or crimes committed by nationals of the state of Palestine outside of that area. So it would extend to attacks carried out, for instance, by Hamas from Gaza into Israel. And the prosecutor of the court wanted to be absolutely sure that they were on the strongest possible legal ground before they conducted this investigation because they knew it would be very controversial. So they actually, in anticipation of this, went to the court and asked for a ruling on whether or not there is a mandate, whether there is jurisdiction to carry out an investigation. And then back in 2021, if I have my years correct, what's known as a chamber, so a subset of judges at the International Criminal Court ruled that there is, in fact, an investigation, a jurisdiction to carry out an investigation linked to the state of Palestine. So that investigation's been underway for the last 3 years, long before these last horrific 9 months. But the first step further to that investigation only happened a few weeks ago when Karim Khan, who is the chief prosecutor connected with the court, announced that he was seeking arrest warrants for 5 individuals, 3 senior Hamas leaders and 2 senior Israeli leaders, including the prime minister and the defense minister. Obviously, that was a huge breakthrough. It's very significant because if there's one thing that has always defined everything about decades of war crimes, crimes against humanity, acts of terrorism, potential plausible genocide in Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, it has been impunity. Complete lack of accountability, especially at the most senior levels, both with respect to the Israeli military and politicians, but also Hamas and armed groups. So this is a big breakthrough. It's still going to be a number of months probably, because what has to happen now is that the court itself is going to rule as to whether those arrest warrants should in fact be issued. I think most people are fairly confident that the court will rule that they should be issued. The legal documentation in support of the applications is very strong. Then the big challenge of how do you execute those arrest warrants emerges. The ICC doesn't have a police force that it gets to send into Gaza or send to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and arrest these five officials. They have to rely on good faith cooperation. They have to rely on other governments being willing to carry out arrest warrants. So, for instance, if Benjamin Netanyahu, just as a what if, was to make a visit to Canada after that arrest warrant has been issued, it wouldn't only be a nice thing. Canada would, as a matter of international law, because we have ratified the Rome Statute that sets up the ICC, we would be legally obliged to arrest him and turn him over to the court. So at a minimum, it's going to significantly, because there's about 125 plus countries around the world that are party to the Rome Statute now. At a minimum, it's going to significantly constrain the countries to which these five individuals can travel.
Wow. So that was the thing that I was thinking, because, you know, Alex, we always get the questions from students and other people around lack of enforceability. So while I was thinking, great, you know, arrest warrants, maybe this will help stop, you know, the potential genocide that's happening. And I only say potential because it hasn't been ruled on yet, but by all accounts, it looks like genocide. Arrest warrants, it sounded like Interpol was going to go in, or some states that would, you know, would be able to go in and arrest him. But I'm assuming then that given all of the other states who are now opposing what Israel's doing, he would have to think very carefully about which, I mean, the only one that would really be 100% safe is the US, I'm assuming. And Canada, I mean, what do you think Canada would do? I mean, it's legally obligated.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question, and there's been a lot of concern about this. So I talked earlier about the disappointing reaction from Canada when the ICJ ruled in the South Africa genocide case. Well, similarly, Canada's reaction after the prosecutor announced he was seeking these arrest warrants was very disappointing. Essentially, once again, just like with the ICJ, we started by saying, we believe in the ICC. We think it's really important, and how could we not? As you may recall, earlier in our conversation, I was highlighting that Canada was one of the big champions that led to the establishment of the ICC. However, we then went on to say, and we heard this from Prime Minister Trudeau, from Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, and Foreign Affairs Minister Joly, that Canada was troubled by the equivalency, that was the word that was used, that the prosecutor was suggesting there is between Hamas and the Israeli government. Now, what they meant by that, there's no legal defense. There's no legal term as to what equivalency they were referring to. It seemed to suggest that they think that a democratic government like Israel should never be held to the same standards or or at a minimum, held to the same level of accountability as a terrorist group like Hamas. Well, there is zero grounds for asserting that in the Rome Statute or anywhere in international law. The whole notion of the International Criminal Court and the International Justice and Accountability Project that it represents is that we don't make those comparisons because no one is above the law. Everyone is held to the same standards, whether you were a leader elected in a absolutely fair democratic election, or whether you are a brutal dictator who has maintained power in your country for 45 years, or whether you're a terrorist group, as Canada has designated Hamas to be. If the evidence suggests that you individually are responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, then the only equivalency that matters is that everyone will be treated the same. So it was very, very disappointing to hear Canada assert this position. We also didn't hear Canada go further, as some other governments, including governments that are supportive of Israel. I'm thinking of Germany, for instance. Germany at least made a public statement saying they too expressed some of those concerns about equivalency, but they did go on to say publicly, we are confirming that if it was to come up, we would execute an arrest warrant against anyone who showed up in German territory. But Canada hasn't even gone so far as to say that. And when journalists have tried to push them on that, they've ducked, and and various government officials have repeatedly come back to this concern about so-called equivalency. It is not our finest hour, and particularly given that we're, a so-called supposed ardent champion of the ICC and international justice.
I guess what concerns me too about Canada is they avoid saying war crime, crimes against humanity, and genocide. They avoid talking about it at all, like even referencing it in their at least from what I've heard, where at least in the circles that I kind of work with, people who practice in international law say there's no question that this is genocide and a war crime and crimes against humanity because of the totality of what has happened and continues to happen. Courts may not have pronounced it that way yet, but I don't think that there's much of a question in terms of like prima facie evidence. And so for Canada to be that way is very, very concerning. I'd like to know what all of the other countries would do.
No, I think it's a really good point, and just to give a very specific example, I talked earlier about the concerns about settlements in the West Bank and how that is unlawful and illegal under the Geneva Conventions, and thus constitutes war crimes. Now, Canada, to its credit, does express concern about, and at least on paper, we may come to this later as to whether they follow it through with anything, at least on paper, opposition to the settlements, which it references as illegal or unlawful, but they never use the language war crimes, which is really what matters, because that's what gives you the clear understanding of how serious the illegality is, and what the implications and consequences are. Because to say something is illegal, maybe that means that you'd get a ticket.
Yeah.
But to say something is a war crime, amongst other things, means that you could be charged by the International Criminal Court that we've just been talking about. And so we really need to start to hear some legal clarity and precision from Canada, Canada of all countries.
Yes. I mean, I just keep thinking about it and thinking about it, or even how the media was originally talking about this, some kind of conflict. Um, and then when it became very clear that this is like an ongoing genocide, but to still kind of talk about it as a conflict when genocide is just genocide, like it's genocide regardless of, I don't know, everything that you said in terms of regardless of what's happened, it's never excusable. And so, okay, here might be a tough question for you, but if Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet were to invite you to a cabinet meeting and say, Alex, tell us your best advice. What should we do as a state? What would you tell them?
Well, I probably would have more than one thing to say, but let's just stick for a first point to where we've, I think, had a lot of our conversation, and that's these international legal cases, because I think Canada really matters in that space because of our history, because of our reputation, and I think it's frankly disgraceful that we've, the most generous description would be that we've ducked and dodged saying what needs to be said here. But I think in fact, by doing so, we've sent a very strong message that undermines the international legal norms and institutions that we say we believe in. So first would be to completely revise the legal strategy we've taken at both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, and make it clear that we absolutely and unconditionally champion the work of those two courts, that we expect every single ruling to be fully and unequivocally complied with, and that we stand ready, and I think this is particularly the case with the International Criminal Court, to provide whatever support is needed, including carrying out arrest warrants if it ever comes to that, and that we firmly condemn what we've seen from other governments, including from our southern neighbor, who have been threatening, and I don't think President Biden's going to sign this into law, but the Republican-controlled House of Representatives has passed a law that would sanction officials who work with the International Criminal Court, judges, prosecutors, court officials, administrators, would face sanctions because of this Palestinian case, and we need to be just absolutely speaking out in opposition to that. Then there's a number of ways in which here at home, and I think this is really important for us to understand. This isn't just about sort of oblique legal questions that are playing out on the world stage. There are some very direct implications within Canada. To use something I was just referencing, for instance, the fact that those settlements in occupied territory are illegal to the level of constituting war crimes. Well, our free trade agreement with Israel, which was updated and renewed only about 6 or 7 years ago, extends to those illegal settlements. So goods and services that are being traded out of those illegal settlements that are war crimes benefit from a Canadian free trade deal. That's got to be plugged. We need to make it very clear that we're not going to allow trade preferences for goods and services coming out of something that constitutes war crimes. Similarly, there's a number of ways in which, in connection with the settlements, but other concerns as well, that there are charitable organizations in Canada that benefit from all that comes with charitable status, and that are funding, fueling, benefiting from war crimes and other human rights violations in Israel and Palestine. I think many people heard recently, a number of months ago, there were 2 synagogues, for instance, that hosted real estate events at which properties in Israel in Israel proper, but also in those illegal settlements that are war crimes, were up for sale, hosted by synagogues that benefit from charitable status in Canada. Arms sales. Canada's, we're obviously not a supplier of arms at the level that the US is to Israel. And a lot of what we do is we provide parts and components that go to the United States and then are made part of weapons that are manufactured there and go on to Israel. The Canadian government is committed to closing that off, but has not yet demonstrated convincingly that they have done so. That is so obvious, and at a minimum, if we can't take measures to ensure that the $20+ million a year, I think is what it's often been, of arms sales to Israel will not, at this time, in the context of plausible genocide in Gaza, stop immediately, stop yesterday, not tomorrow, then what do we stand for if we can't even do that? And then I would also say to Prime Minister Trudeau and the cabinet that there's a lot that needs to happen with respect to justice and accountability. We have finally sanctioned, I think, just 3 extremist individuals who are leaders of some of those settlements in the West Bank, but that's as far as we've gone under Canadian law. There are a number of both. I mean, Hamas itself is a designated terrorist group, but leaders of Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups have long ago been sanctioned. We need to see greater sanctioning under Canadian law, including politically. I would argue that Benjamin Netanyahu should be sanctioned under Canadian law. And then beyond that, justice and accountability measures. This takes us back, I guess, partially to the need to be supporting the International Criminal Court. But beyond that, we have Canadian legal measures that allow individuals who are responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, in Gaza, in Israel, in the West Bank, associated with Israel or associated with Hamas and armed Palestinian groups, to be tried under Canadian legal provisions in Canadian legal courts. We should be ensuring that we are doing everything possible to ensure that those Canadian laws are being activated and used at this time. That's just a handful. There's more.
Just a handful. But honestly, that's why I ask you these questions, because we talk about, well, here's what's happening. Here's what's happening in the courts. But a lot of people ask, okay, so what should Canada be doing? What it has done, but what should it be doing? And I don't know that everybody, I know I certainly didn't put together the war crime of the illegal settlements with charitable organizations in Canada either benefiting from that or engaging in land sales that are part of that war crime. Like, I just haven't put all of those things together. So I think it's really important. And I'm hoping that the cabinet is listening to this. And I'm also hoping, because when I announced this, I said, send me your questions, through social media or attend here or whatever. And I had some comments from people saying that the coverage isn't fair for Israel, that under international law, the international courts, United Nations bodies, Israel is totally being condemned and no one's condemning Hamas, like the attack by Hamas, the armed Palestinian groups. First of all, is that true? And given what you said earlier about this, lack of equivalency in deeds, is that a concern to you at all? Like this feeling that, oh, everybody's just picking on Israel and no one's picking on Palestine?
So, I think there's a couple of things we have to keep in mind here. So, the Israeli government and Hamas are two very different entities on the world stage under international law. The Israeli government is a government representing a state. Hamas is not. um, uh, Gaza or Palestine is not a full member of the United Nations. Hamas doesn't have standing, isn't there at the United Nations in a full sense. And so that means that, yes, there are some instances, and what's happening at the International Court of Justice would be a very clear example, that Israel can be taken in front of the International Court of Justice, and that is what has happened in the South African case, but Hamas can't. It's how our international legal order is set up, and that's not just Hamas specific. That's any armed opposition group, any terrorist group. They are not a state, and therefore they're not held to the levels of accountability that we expect of states. They're not brought in front of bodies like the International Court of Justice. Now, notably, even though the International Court of Justice didn't have jurisdiction over Hamas because it's not a state, they did nonetheless in their ruling. It's not a direct part of the case, but they were particularly concerned about Hamas's actions on October the 7th, and in particular the fact that Hamas was continuing to hold hostages, which is a crime under international law. That's a war crime. And the ICJ did comment on that. And they did call, even though it doesn't have the full force of law because Hamas isn't part of the case, but I think it's important to know that the ICJ expressed that concern and did call on Hamas to release the hostages. We then slip to the International Criminal Court, and now we have a very different reality. Here, Hamas leaders are very much in play. They are held to the same accountability that the leaders of a military are, that the leaders of a government are, because the International Criminal Court is about individuals, regardless of what your political standing or affiliation, member of a government, member of an armed group is. So now we have a very important moment where these concerns that, the international system isn't paying enough attention to Hamas can be addressed. But what do we see? We see Canada condemning the ICC for this false notion of equivalency. We have Israel refusing to cooperate with the ICC. We've got the United States passing laws, which I remain confident President Biden will not sign into law, but punishing court officials for daring to do their job. So the very moment at which the international legal system is ready and prepared to hold Hamas officials accountable, and far too many governments are undermining that court's work. So you can't have it both ways, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. One last point here is I would want people to be very much aware of the fact that there's a fairly new, very consequential UN report about what's been happening over these last 9 months. It comes from something known as the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel. This is a body that was set up by the UN Human Rights Council over 2 years ago, so it's not specific to what's been happening in Gaza over these last 9 months, but that certainly includes what's happening in Gaza over the last 9 months. They've just put out a major important report, and it's absolutely all about Hamas's crimes as well. So the notion that somehow the UN is only targeting Israel is completely put to bed by the work of the Commission of Inquiry, which documents, condemns war crimes committed by Hamas, especially since October the 7th, including the hostages, including the attacks that happened, including the concerns that have been made that Hamas committed acts of sexual violence, particularly during the attacks on October the 7th. So the UN is not ducking it.
And that's good to hear, because I do hear a lot of resistance that it's, anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic to say that Israel is committing a war crime when in fact we're not talking about the Jewish faith or Jewish people or even the citizens of Israel. It's the government and the actions that they're taking. And so I really appreciate how you're, you know, going through and being very, very particular about that. I know that we're at 4:30, and I promise not to keep you beyond 4:30, but I just have so many other questions, and I'm trying to think about what would be the most important to ask.
Well, maybe
But
we
I
go to that last question we were thinking about what can people do?
Yes, 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 yes. Yeah, because we see the encampments and students rising up against genocide and injustice. So, like, what can people do? That's the number one question.
So I think there's a lot of ways for people to be very active, and you can do all of this, or you can do one of these things. I think it's about what speaks to you. I would start with be a supportive ally. That always matters, but that matters so much right now. I'm sure we all have friends, colleagues, neighbors, coworkers who are in considerable distress. Palestinian Canadians, members of the Muslim community, members of the Jewish community, who have direct fear about loved ones who are in the region, or more widely are simply anguished and traumatized by what's happening. And I think reaching out, seeing the ways in which we can be supportive as an ally, as a friend, to those who are feeling that sense of distress, I think is really important. There is such immense humanitarian need in Gaza in particular right now. It's beyond measure. I mean, everyone's seen the images. It's impossible to. I look at that and I'm absolutely stunned that agencies are still managing to provide some humanitarian relief in that context with everything just devastated and destroyed and infrastructure completely bombed. So look for the groups that are managing to do that. Some of the ones I'm aware of and I'm supportive of include Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, Islamic Relief, and the one that is the humanitarian lifeline, and which of course has been pilloried by Israel. And Canada's been a bit back and forth on this, but it's the UN agency that I mentioned a long time ago that was set up way back in 1948, the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which is the overwhelming major humanitarian lifeline for Palestinian refugees throughout the region, including in Gaza. They've had their funding frozen by a number of governments, including the US. Canada temporarily froze it, but has thawed that freezing. But they deserve support. And then there's all sorts of small organizations. You can, do your own research, who are doing amazing things on the ground in Gaza. Look out for that. Number three, I'd encourage people to think about how they can engage in conversations about this. It's so toxic. It's so divisive. It so readily goes to accusations and hate. And we so very much need to be finding the ways to have conversations that are looking about how do we build some bridges? How do we foster shared perspectives? How do we focus in on some of these core legal principles about genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity, instead of just looking for ways to tar different groups with recriminations and accusations? I think we can all think about how we're contributing to those conversations,
Mhm.
and do so as positively as we can. You referenced the encampments. Pam, I would really urge, especially for people who live in cities where there are encampments, reach out. See what's going on there. It's incredible what students are doing. In my own city at the University of Ottawa, the encampment has been underway for 7 weeks or so now, since the beginning of May. The courage, the conviction that lies behind that is remarkable. And if you haven't had a chance to do so yet, drop by, have some conversation, and break through some of the the assumptions and myths about what the encampments are or are not trying to achieve. And then lastly, look for the advocacy possibilities. Press your member of parliament with respect to some of the things we've been talking about here. The fact that we have a free trade deal that extends to illegal settlements, the fact that our government has not strongly come out in support of the ICJ and ICC cases. And so many other possibilities. You can just reach out to your MP yourself, make a phone call, send an email. There's lots of organizations that have petitions and letter writing possibilities. I know Amnesty International does, Independent Jewish Voices, the National Council on Canadian Muslims, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, and others. I think Oxfam has had petitions. There's lots out there. Look at what's on offer of similarity. There's differences, and find what aligns with what your concerns are, and don't just stop, although it's important, on making the donations for the humanitarian relief, but raise your voice. Find ways to press, and we're in Canada, so the easiest is to press our own government, to press our government to be doing what international law requires with respect to this situation.
Well, those are really specific things, actions that people can take, because we never want to just be aware or informed. We want to be educated for taking action purposes. And, you've just mentioned so many things, the history, the law, the terminology. I think you mentioned early on about the two-state solution, like what would bring peace in the end. And I think you said it was the recognition of these two states. I wish we had 2 more hours to talk about that, because I think that's important too.
And it is, and maybe just on one last note here,
Yeah.
because it occurs to me as when you reference the two-state solution, that one really important international legal principle that hasn't yet come up is self-determination. Which is, I know you know this, Pam, the two most important international human rights treaties we have, what are known as the two covenants, one dealing with civil and political rights, one dealing with economic, social, and cultural rights. What is so remarkable about those two covenants is they both have the same first article, Article 1, in each of those covenants, and it's the right to self-determination. And that's, especially with respect to the Palestinian people, is what's at play here. They have for decades now been denied that essential right. The two-state solution, there of course is political debate about a variety of options, but I think the one that gets the most pickup, because it was agreed to by Palestinian and Israeli officials back in 1993, is the two-state solution. And if we finally did see that come to fruition, then that foundational right of self-determination would finally see some respect.
Well, I like that we ended on that, what Canadians can do, and also the right of self-determination that we would expect any, of these, of a people to have. And it's, definitely something that we consider to be important. I don't see any extra questions online, but you had sent me all of your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Alex and I would literally have to be here, I think, for the full day, and he probably doesn't have that amount of time. But thank you, Alex. I really, really, really appreciate the time you take, as you always do, to help educate about human rights and the law. Less politics, more law, and how we all play a role in ensuring that everyone gets to enjoy those rights. Because if we start creating a system where we can just, without accountability, ignore all of these court decisions and laws, that won't be good for us someday either. And I know Alex and I want to specifically acknowledge the very powerful and sustained advocacy of students and doctors and lawyers and academics and leaders and grassroots people from all over the world of all backgrounds, including Palestinians and Israelis, like people in Israel saying, hey, you need to stop this, and many, many Jewish organizations, who all of whom are condemning the violence, the horrific loss of life. They've protested, created encampments, written letters, sent petitions, organized rallies, conducted teach-ins, raised funding, and have spoken out publicly, which I think is the key when we're talking about something as big as genocide. Thank you all for not looking away. That's how genocides are allowed to continue. And I believe, as I'm sure Alex does, that we can push governments to do what's right and protect people from these grave human rights abuses. Thank you for joining us. And in case you want to help us, you can, share this, use it as a teaching tool, share it with your friends and family. Maybe it's the start of a conversation, things you didn't know, and help us educate a larger audience. And I'll make sure in the description box to post links to where you can learn more. And thank you again, Alex, for doing this for us.
Oh, thank you, Pam. I mean, I never say no to these kinds of conversations with you. Oh no, honestly, wherever it takes us, because you do so from such a place of an authentic commitment to learning and awareness and building understanding, and that's at the very heart of any human rights challenge. So thank you so much for giving us all that opportunity.
Well, thank you, and I'm sure we'll talk again. Thanks to everyone. The video will be uploaded on YouTube as soon as we're done this live. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon, and hope you get out there and do something for justice.